The night had fallen heavy over the empty road when Maria shifted her old sedan into neutral and waited at the stop sign, humming softly to herself, thinking only about the groceries resting in the back seat and the warmth of her small house that waited just a few miles away. She had never been the type of woman who drew attention, never been bold, never been reckless, just simple in her ways, careful with her choices, and satisfied with a quiet life that carried no great drama. But fate has strange ways of tearing quiet lives apart, and sometimes the simplest souls are tested in the harshest fires. She did not notice the car pulling up behind her until the glare of the high beams washed over her rear window and blinded her for a second. She tapped her brakes, confused, and glanced into her mirror to see the outline of a police cruiser. Relief swept over her chest at first because, like many people, she had been raised to think that a flashing light meant safety, meant help, meant some order in the dark. But this night, the lights meant something else entirely, something she could not have imagined as she rolled her window down and waited for the officer to step out. The man who walked toward her car did not walk with the calm, measured confidence of a protector but with the restless twitch of someone coiled too tight. His hand brushed the weapon at his side before he even spoke, and when his face leaned into the cone of her headlights she saw not kindness or duty but a hard sneer, the kind that carried more contempt than words ever could. He asked her name in a tone that was not a question but an accusation, asked where she was going like it was none of her business, and when she answered softly, he smirked as though every syllable was some personal offense. She noticed the way his finger tapped at his holster, noticed how his eyes never stayed still, darting to her purse, to the groceries, to her trembling hands on the wheel. She told herself to stay calm, to comply, to keep her voice low, because simple women survive by avoiding storms, not walking into them. But storms have a way of choosing you. When he barked at her to step out of the car, she obeyed, clutching her coat tighter around herself against the cold, her heart beginning to pound harder than the wind could chill. The road was empty, no headlights in the distance, no houses within sight, just her, him, and the endless stretch of asphalt cutting through the trees. He circled her like a wolf circles prey, asking why she was alone, asking if she thought she was better than him, asking if she carried anything worth taking. His words slurred at the edges, like a man who had been drinking, but his grip on the weapon was too steady to ignore. Maria nodded to everything, agreed to everything, praying that submission would end the encounter. But then, without warning, he pulled his gun and pointed it straight at her chest. The sound of metal leaving the holster froze the breath in her lungs, and the dark circle of the barrel became the only thing she could see. She tried to speak, tried to plead, but before her voice could rise, he pulled the trigger. The first shot tore through the silence like lightning splitting the sky, burning past her shoulder and shattering the side mirror of her car. She stumbled back, clutching at the air, her scream breaking into the night. He laughed, a raw, jagged laugh, and fired again, the bullet skimming across the hood of her sedan. She realized then with a clarity she had never felt before. He was not trying to control her, not trying to arrest her, but to kill her for no reason other than the sickness in his own mind. She was supposed to be a victim. She was supposed to be another story no one would believe. But Maria was not ready to die. In the chaos of her panic, her hand brushed against her purse where, weeks ago, after a string of robberies in her neighborhood, she had hidden a small revolver her late father had left her. She had never fired it, never wanted to, but her fingers wrapped around the cold grip as though destiny had been waiting for this exact second. Her breath steadied, not completely but enough, and when the next flash came from his gun, she ducked low, pulled the revolver free, and without thinking aimed back at the shadow that was about to end her life. The first shot she fired cracked through the trees and sent him stumbling, not falling, but startled that prey had turned to predator. His eyes widened, rage replacing his laughter, and he roared as he lifted his weapon again. Maria's body trembled, her ears rang, but her hands moved on their own. She fired again, and this time she saw him stagger sideways, clutching his side, disbelief painted across his face like he could not fathom that the simple woman standing in front of him had dared to fight back. The night swallowed every sound except the thunder of their guns, predator and prey locked in a duel neither had expected. And for the first time in her life Maria understood that simplicity does not mean weakness. It only means a heart has been waiting, silently, for the moment it must prove its strength. The echo of gunfire still shivered through the empty road, the acrid smoke of powder mixing with the cold air, and Maria's chest heaved as if she had been running for miles though her feet had hardly moved. The officer, or the man who wore the uniform like a mask, was crouched now, his weapon shaking slightly in his blood-stained hand, and for a fleeting moment she thought he might give up, that he might lower the gun and accept defeat. But men like him do not surrender easily, not when arrogance is stitched so deeply into their skin, and his lips curled into a snarl as he lifted the weapon again, firing blindly toward her. The bullet slammed into the frame of her car, sending sparks and shards of paint flying, and Maria ducked low, pressing her back against the cold steel of the door, the revolver clutched so tight in her fist that her knuckles screamed with pain. She had never imagined her life would narrow to this one moment, a woman who worked in a grocery store, who planted flowers in her backyard, who had never broken a single law, now crouching in the dark with death circling her. She could hear him breathing heavily, each grunt like a beast that refused to die, and then his voice rose in a hoarse shout, calling her a coward, daring her to show herself, promising she would not leave the road alive. Something inside Maria shifted then, some fragile part of her snapping clean in two, because she understood that fear would only carry her so far, that hiding would not save her, and that this fight had been forced upon her with no escape except through him. She leaned sideways, her breath steadying for just a second, and she fired again. The shot rang out like a command, striking his shoulder and jerking his body backward. His cry of rage echoed across the trees, and for the first time his stance faltered, his knees buckling as the gun slipped from his hand and clattered against the asphalt. She wanted to collapse, to throw the revolver away and run, but her body refused, caught between instinct and adrenaline, and she watched him struggle, watched him crawl toward the weapon as if nothing mattered but dragging her down into the grave with him. Her father's voice whispered in her memory, words from years ago when he had first shown her the revolver, telling her that a weapon is not for pride or for power but for survival, and that if she ever raised it, she must finish what she started. Tears blurred her eyes, but her aim did not waver as she raised the revolver again, calling out for him to stop, begging him to leave it, but he only growled and reached faster. She pulled the trigger a fourth time, and this shot tore through his thigh, spinning him onto his back, his scream breaking the night into pieces. He lay there writhing, the uniform that once symbolized safety now nothing more than a blood-stained disguise, and Maria felt her stomach twist as she realized she had done the unthinkable, that she had turned herself into the last thing she ever wanted to be. But then she looked at him. His eyes still filled with hate, his hands clawing at the ground, searching still for the weapon though his body was breaking, and she understood again that this was not about choice anymore. This was survival, stripped bare and brutal. She backed away toward her car, keeping her revolver trained on him, her heart hammering as she tried to decide whether to drive away or to finish it, whether to leave him to fate or carve fate herself. His voice broke into laughter again, wet and choking, but laughter nonetheless, and he spat blood as he told her she would never escape, that others would come, that no one would believe her story, that she would always be hunted now. His words poisoned the air, but Maria swallowed them down like bitter medicine, forcing herself not to bend under them, because she knew deep inside that her truth was stronger than his lies. She slid into her car, her hand trembling so violently on the keys that she dropped them twice before the engine roared to life, and she pressed the gas hard, sending the sedan screaming down the road away from him, away from the burning echo of what she had just done. But the road did not give her peace. It stretched endlessly, the headlights carving narrow tunnels through the darkness, and every shadow on the shoulder seemed to rise into his figure again, every bend in the asphalt whispered of pursuit. She gripped the wheel until her fingers throbbed, her revolver still heavy on her lap, and she knew this was not over, that shooting back had saved her life for the moment but had also written her into a story she never asked to be part of. As the miles passed and the red glow of taillights never appeared ahead, Maria realized she had a choice, to keep driving until the world swallowed her whole, or to turn back and face the storm that had chosen her. And in the fragile, trembling silence of her car, the decision began to shape itself like fire-hardening steel, because she was no longer just a simple woman, no longer only a victim. She was something else now, forged by the shots she had fired, and the night was not done testing her yet. The road unrolled beneath her tires like an endless ribbon of black, the white lines flashing past in steady rhythm, and Maria's eyes burned from the strain of staring too hard into the darkness ahead. Her body shook from the rush of adrenaline that still refused to leave her veins, each beat of her heart slamming against her ribs as though it might burst free. The revolver lay heavy in her lap, the smell of gunpowder still clinging to her clothes, and every time her gaze flicked down she saw not just a weapon but a reminder of what she had done, what she had been forced to do. The man in uniform haunted her rearview mirror even though the road behind her remained empty, his twisted grin flickering in her mind as though it had branded itself onto her soul. She tried to convince herself that he would not follow, that he was too wounded, that he could not rise again, but doubt chewed at her relentlessly. Men like him did not die easily, not when their hatred burned hotter than their blood. She pressed harder on the gas pedal, her sedan shuddering as the speed climbed, the engine groaning in protest, but no amount of distance seemed enough. She longed to see the glow of a town, a gas station, a diner, any sign of life where she could step into the light and call for help, but the road gave her only shadows and silence. Hours seemed to stretch though only minutes had passed, and finally in the distance she caught sight of a small wooden sign that pointed toward a rural highway station. Relief trickled through her like water over cracked stone, fragile but real, and she turned down the road, her headlights catching the faint outline of a building with a single dim bulb burning above the door. She pulled into the gravel lot, her tires crunching loud in the stillness, and for a moment she just sat there gripping the wheel, unable to move, as if stepping out of the car might shatter the thin thread of safety she had found. When she finally forced herself to open the door, the night air rushed over her face, and she staggered toward the building, the revolver tucked into her coat pocket though her hands trembled too much to hold it steady. The station looked half abandoned, the paint peeling, the windows coated in dust, but when she pushed the door open a bell chimed weakly, and a man behind the counter lifted his head. He was older, his beard white and his eyes heavy with the weight of someone who had seen too many hard years. He studied her carefully, not with suspicion but with concern, and asked if she was all right. Maria tried to answer but her voice cracked, the words tangled, until finally she blurted that a man had tried to kill her, that he had been a police officer, that she had no choice but to shoot back. The man's face tightened, his eyes narrowing as though he weighed every word, and for a long moment the silence between them was unbearable. Then he nodded slowly and motioned for her to sit. He told her his name was Harris, that he had run the station for decades, and that out here in the dark corners of the county, not every officer wore the badge for the right reasons. Maria clutched the counter, desperate for assurance, asking if he believed her, and Harris leaned forward, lowering his voice, telling her that he did believe her, but that believing was not enough. If the man she had fought truly was one of those corrupt enforcers, then she had stirred a nest of snakes and more would come hunting. The words froze her blood, but the truth of them was undeniable, echoing what the wounded officer had snarled before she fled. Harris warned her not to go to the nearest precinct, not yet, because too many of those wearing uniforms in the area owed loyalty to one another instead of the law. Instead, he offered her a cup of coffee and told her to wait while he made a call to someone he trusted outside the county who might know what to do. Maria sat there at the small wooden table, her hands wrapped around the chipped mug, staring at the rising steam as if it could carry her away. The warmth eased the shaking in her fingers but could not calm the storm in her chest. Every sound outside the thin walls made her flinch, every passing gust of wind became footsteps, every creak in the wood became the cocking of a gun. Harris returned after a few minutes, his face grave, and told her he had reached a contact who could help, but it would take time for them to arrive, maybe hours. Until then she would need to stay hidden, stay quiet, and trust that the night did not betray them. Maria nodded, though trust felt like a word from another life. She followed Harris to a small storage room in the back, where the smell of oil and dust filled the air, and he told her she could rest there, away from prying eyes. She sat on a stack of boxes, the revolver clutched once more in her hand, listening to the faint hum of a radio outside and the ticking of a clock on the wall. Exhaustion pressed against her, but she dared not close her eyes because every time she blinked she saw him again, the officer lying in the road, blood spreading across his uniform, his laughter carrying into the darkness, his warning that she would never escape. And as the hours dragged, Maria began to wonder if survival meant more than just escaping bullets, if it meant carrying the weight of what she had done for the rest of her life, if it meant standing against a storm that had only just begun to break. The hours bled together in the cramped storage room until time itself felt like a cruel trick, each tick of the clock dragging slower than the last, and Maria sat with her knees drawn up, the revolver balanced loosely in her lap, her eyes fixed on the sliver of light under the door. Every sound outside made her muscles tighten, every crack of the old building made her finger twitch, and though Harris checked on her once or twice, urging her to rest, she knew there would be no rest, not while the memory of that road burned in her mind. Just when her body began to sag under exhaustion, the crunch of tires on gravel jolted her upright, and she pressed her ear to the wall, straining to hear. Harris's voice carried faintly through the air, cautious, steady, and then another voice, younger, sharper, carrying the clipped cadence of someone in uniform. Maria's blood turned cold, and she clutched the revolver tighter, whispering to herself not to panic, not to rush, because she could not be sure yet if danger had truly arrived. She crept closer to the door, her breath held tight, and listened as Harris spoke low, telling the visitor the station was closed, that it was late, that he had nothing to sell. But the younger voice pushed harder, asking if he had seen a woman alone on the road, a woman who had shot at an officer during a stop. Maria's heart slammed against her ribs, and she felt the weight of fate tightening around her like a snare. She did not hear Harris betray her, not outright, but the pause in his words was long, too long, and her trust wavered. The younger man's boots scraped against the floorboards, closer now, the creak of the old building betraying his steps, and Maria realized he was walking toward the back, toward the storage room. She had seconds to choose, seconds to decide whether to burst out or to remain hidden, and the thought of being cornered without control filled her with a terror that twisted her stomach. She gripped the revolver and pulled herself to the side of the door, crouched low, her ears straining as the steps drew nearer. Then the knob rattled, slow at first, then firmer, and a voice called through, telling her to open up, telling her he knew she was inside. Maria's lungs froze, her finger tightening on the trigger, when suddenly Harris's voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding, telling the visitor to leave, that there was nothing for him here, that he had no right to search private property. The younger voice bristled, cursed, and then after a tense silence, the sound of boots retreated toward the front. The slam of the outer door followed, and the gravel crunched again as a car pulled away. Maria collapsed against the wall, her breath shuddering, sweat cold across her forehead. Moments later, Harris opened the storage door, his eyes heavy but steady, and told her the deputy was gone, that for now she was safe. But safe felt like an illusion, fragile and fleeting, and Maria pressed him for answers, for the truth of what was happening outside. Harris finally sat down on a crate, rubbing his hands together, and confessed that the man hunting her was not just some rogue officer but part of a circle, a brotherhood of men in uniform who used their positions for power and fear, who had silenced anyone who dared to speak against them. Maria listened in horror, realizing that the man she had shot might not die quietly, and even if he did, others would carry his grudge. Harris told her that the contact he had called earlier was on the way, a retired detective from a neighboring county who had spent years trying to expose the corruption, someone who might help her find a way out. Maria clung to those words like a lifeline, but the unease gnawed at her still, because she knew every mile of road between here and safety was shadowed by men who saw her not as a woman but as a threat to be erased. As the night crawled toward dawn, her body finally sagged with fatigue, and she drifted into a half-sleep, dreams haunted by flashes of gunfire and the officer's laughter echoing in the dark. She woke with a start when headlights swept across the walls of the station, and Harris's voice called gently that it was time. A car had pulled up outside, an old sedan, and from it stepped a man with a heavy coat and eyes that scanned the lot with the weariness of someone who had lived too long in the crosshairs of danger. Harris introduced him as Detective Cole, and though Maria wanted to shrink back, something in his measured gaze steadied her. He spoke quietly, telling her he had heard everything, that he knew what kind of men these were, that she had been caught in the fire of a war most people never saw. Maria felt tears sting her eyes as she asked him if there was any way out, if she would ever be free, and Cole's jaw tightened before he answered. Freedom, he said, would not come from running alone. It would come from standing, from exposing them, from turning the same weapon of truth they had buried against them. The words terrified her as much as they stirred something fierce inside, because she realized that survival might not mean hiding forever, that perhaps her fate had been tied to something larger the moment she pulled that trigger on the empty road. She followed Cole and Harris out into the morning chill, the horizon bleeding pale light, and as the three of them stood in the gravel lot, Maria understood that the battle was far from over. The night had given her no peace, but with the dawn came a decision, and though her hands still shook, her resolve began to steady. She was no longer simply a woman fleeing death. She was a woman standing on the edge of a war she had not chosen but could no longer escape. The chill of morning clung to Maria's skin as she climbed into the back seat of Cole's sedan, the revolver heavy in her pocket and her heart thudding with the steady rhythm of dread. Harris stood in the doorway of the station, his figure outlined against the pale glow of dawn, and gave her a slow nod that spoke more than words, as if he were passing a burden into her hands, a burden too heavy for most but one she had no choice but to carry. Cole slid behind the wheel, his eyes scanning the horizon in quick, practiced sweeps before he started the engine and pulled onto the road. For a long time, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only with the low hum of the car and the occasional crackle of the police scanner mounted to the dashboard. Maria studied the back of his head, the strands of gray in his dark hair, the stiff line of his shoulders, and wondered if she could trust him. Every man in uniform now looked like an enemy to her, every badge a mask for violence, and though Cole was no longer on the force, the scent of that world clung to him like smoke. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but edged with steel, telling her that the man she had shot had survived, that word had already spread through the network of corrupt officers, and that they were rallying like wolves scenting blood. Maria felt her throat tighten, the memory of bullets slicing past her body flooding back, and she asked him if running would be enough. Cole shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on the road, and told her that running might keep her alive for a week, maybe a month, but not forever. The only way out was through. He explained that years ago he had tried to expose them, had gathered files and testimonies, but each time he pushed, the evidence vanished, the witnesses silenced, the truth buried beneath the weight of fear. Now, he said, with her survival, with the fact that one of them had bled because of her, there was a chance, slim but real, to turn the tide. Maria stared out the window at the endless stretch of farmland rolling past, her stomach churning. She had never been part of battles larger than paying rent on time or making sure the stove was off before bed. Now this stranger was telling her she was the key to unraveling men who had built an empire of fear. She asked him what he expected of her, and Cole's eyes flicked to hers in the mirror, steady and unflinching, as he said he expected her to fight, to testify, to refuse to disappear like the others. Her first instinct was to scream no, to demand he turn the car around, to insist that all she wanted was her small life back. But the words stuck in her throat, because deep down she knew there was no going back, not after what she had seen, not after what she had done. The road led forward, and whether she wanted it or not, she was bound to it. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher, and eventually Cole pulled into a deserted rest area hidden by a grove of trees. He parked and turned to face her, laying out a battered leather folder filled with notes, photographs, and names scrawled in sharp handwriting. Maria leaned forward, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages, seeing faces of men she did not know, learning of crimes that stretched far beyond her own encounter. Extortion, trafficking, disappearances buried as accidents. Each page burned heavier into her chest until she closed the folder and whispered that it was too much, too big. Cole leaned closer, his voice low but fierce, reminding her that evil survived not because it was strong but because too many looked away. He told her that he could protect her, but only if she helped him finish what he had started. Maria pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, the war raging inside her louder than the world outside, and after a long silence she nodded. Not because she felt brave but because she knew there was no other choice. They drove again, heading toward a small safe house where Cole said they could regroup, but as the miles stretched, Maria noticed a car trailing them in the distance, its shape constant in the mirror. Her pulse quickened and she whispered a warning. Cole's eyes flicked to the glass, his jaw tightening, and without hesitation he turned down a narrow dirt road, weaving through the trees until the car behind them vanished from sight. They sat in the silence of the woods, both breathing hard, listening for the sound of pursuit. Maria's hands clenched around the revolver, her knuckles pale, and she realized this was only the beginning of the hunt. Cole finally exhaled, muttering that they had little time left, that the net was already tightening. Maria closed her eyes, steadying her breath, and in that stillness she felt something she had not before, not peace but resolve, a fragile steel forming in her chest. She was still afraid, maybe more than ever, but fear no longer chained her. It was shaping her, pushing her forward, binding her to the fire that had chosen her. When they started the car again, the road ahead seemed darker than ever, but Maria no longer asked if she would survive. She asked instead how far she was willing to go, how much she was willing to sacrifice, to make sure the men who hunted her never hunted another soul again. The safe house was nothing more than a weathered cabin tucked deep into the woods, its roof sagging slightly under years of storms, its windows clouded by dust. But to Maria it looked like a fortress compared to the open road. Cole parked the sedan beneath the cover of pines and led her inside, his movements sharp and methodical, checking each corner as though expecting enemies to spring from the shadows. The air inside smelled of damp wood and stale air, the silence broken only by the groan of floorboards beneath their steps. Maria wrapped her arms around herself, the revolver hidden still in her pocket, and asked if this place was truly safe. Cole gave a small nod but his eyes betrayed caution, telling her that no place was ever fully safe, only safer than the one before. He set the battered folder on a scarred wooden table and began spreading out maps and photographs, muttering to himself about routes and contacts, while Maria sank into a chair, her body trembling from exhaustion she no longer had strength to hide. She wanted to sleep, to collapse into silence, but every time she closed her eyes she saw the officer's sneer, the flash of the gun, the sound of bullets slicing through the night. Cole noticed her shaking and poured water into a tin cup, sliding it across the table, telling her to drink, telling her she needed her strength because the fight was only just beginning. Maria lifted the cup with both hands, sipping slowly, her throat raw, and whispered that she had never asked for this war. Cole's gaze softened for a moment, the lines of weariness deepening around his eyes, and he told her no one ever asked for it, not the ones who ended up in the crosshairs, but sometimes the war came anyway, and the choice was not whether to fight but whether to survive. His words sat heavy in the air, and Maria turned them over in her mind, realizing the truth of them, realizing she had been drafted into a battle she could not walk away from. Hours passed in tense quiet as Cole worked, making notes, circling names, and Maria dozed fitfully, jerking awake at the slightest sound. The sun dipped low, shadows stretching long, when suddenly the silence was shattered by the distant crunch of tires on gravel. Cole's head snapped up, his hand reaching instinctively for the pistol at his side, and Maria's heart surged into her throat. They moved to the window, peering through the dusty glass, and saw a black SUV crawling up the narrow path, its headlights dimmed, its movements predatory. Cole cursed under his breath and ordered Maria to stay low, telling her the men inside would not be friends. Panic surged through her, but her hand went to the revolver without thought, her grip tightening as if it were the only anchor she had. Cole grabbed the folder from the table, stuffing the papers into a worn backpack, and within seconds the cabin transformed from refuge to trap. The SUV stopped outside, doors opening, boots hitting the dirt, and low voices carried through the trees. Maria's chest burned with fear, but she steadied herself, crouching beside the table, revolver raised. Cole positioned himself by the doorway, his gun steady, his eyes sharp, whispering that if they wanted to live, they had to move fast and hit hard. The first knock on the cabin door was not polite. It was a pounding demand, a voice shouting for them to open up, claiming to be law enforcement, claiming to have authority. Maria recognized the tone, the same poison she had heard on the empty road, and she knew instantly that these were not men of law but men of power hiding behind the badge. Cole gave her a quick glance, a signal, and then the pounding came again, louder, the door shuddering on its hinges. Without warning, the lock splintered and the door swung inward, and the night exploded into chaos. Maria fired first, the crack of her revolver cutting through the air, sending one of the intruders staggering back with a cry. Cole moved with ruthless precision, his shots controlled, each one deliberate, driving the attackers back toward the SUV. Bullets tore into the cabin walls, wood splintering, glass shattering, and Maria ducked behind the table, heart hammering, ears ringing. She rose again, squeezing the trigger, and another figure fell into the dirt, his weapon slipping from his grasp. For a moment it felt endless, the thunder of gunfire, the smoke thickening, the screams echoing through the trees, but then silence fell as quickly as the storm had begun. Cole lowered his gun, chest heaving, scanning the shadows for movement. Two bodies lay motionless outside, another groaning weakly near the SUV, and the stench of blood mixed with the gunpowder that hung heavy in the air. Maria's hands shook violently as she lowered her revolver, the weight of what she had done pressing down, but Cole's voice snapped her back, telling her they had no time, that more would come, that the noise would draw them like vultures. He hauled the backpack over his shoulder, urging her toward the back door, and together they slipped into the dark woods, the cabin burning behind them in her memory though no fire touched it. The night swallowed them whole, the trees closing around them, each step a reminder that survival was fragile and fleeting. Maria's breath came in ragged gasps, her legs aching, but she pushed on, following Cole's shadow deeper into the forest. Somewhere behind them engines roared to life, voices shouted, and she knew the hunt had only grown fiercer. Yet even in the terror, even in the pounding of her heart, she felt something new spark inside her, not just fear but defiance, a flame that whispered she would not go quietly into the dark, that if they wanted her silence, they would have to earn it with their blood. The forest closed in around them, the branches clawing at Maria's coat as she stumbled after Cole, her lungs burning with each breath and her ears straining for the sound of pursuit. The night was alive with echoes, distant shouts, the crack of branches under heavy boots, the low rumble of engines prowling the dirt paths, and though the darkness gave them cover, it also swallowed every direction until Maria felt as though they were running blind through an endless maze of shadows. Cole moved with grim purpose, his steps sure, his gun held low but ready, glancing back now and then to make sure she was still behind him. Maria gripped the revolver in one hand, her other hand brushing against tree trunks to steady herself, and whispered if they would make it out alive. Cole didn't slow, didn't look back, only muttered that survival depended on staying 2 steps ahead, and if they fell behind even once, it would be over. They pushed deeper until the forest thinned and opened into a rocky clearing where the moonlight poured pale silver across the ground. Maria collapsed onto a boulder, gasping for air, her body trembling from exhaustion, but Cole crouched beside her, scanning the treeline, his eyes narrow and calculating. He pulled a map from his jacket, spreading it against the rock, and pointed to a small river that cut through the woods a few miles east. If they reached it, he said, they could follow it downstream to an old mill where allies might be waiting, people he trusted to keep them hidden for a while. Maria nodded weakly, though the thought of more miles on her aching legs made her stomach sink. She asked him why he trusted these allies when so many others had turned, and Cole's gaze hardened as he explained that these were men and women who had once worn the badge but had walked away rather than sell their souls, people who had lost families, reputations, everything to the corruption now hunting them. Maria listened, her chest tightening as she realized she was not the only one torn from an ordinary life by this hidden war, that others had been shattered long before her. Before she could answer, a crack of twigs split the silence, sharp and close, and Cole's hand shot up to signal her stillness. He motioned for her to stay low as he crept toward the sound, his pistol steady, and Maria held her breath, clutching her revolver until her knuckles throbbed. Then a beam of light cut through the trees, sweeping the clearing, and shouts erupted as armed figures burst from the shadows. Gunfire roared instantly, the air alive with the scream of bullets tearing bark and stone, and Maria threw herself flat as Cole returned fire with ruthless precision. Sparks flared against the rocks, branches snapped, and the acrid smoke of powder choked the air. Maria raised her revolver, firing blindly toward the shapes in the trees, and one cry told her she had struck true. She scrambled behind the boulder, heart hammering, her ears ringing, and Cole shouted for her to move, to stay with him. They darted from cover to cover, the attackers pressing closer, their voices snarling commands. Maria's legs burned, but she forced herself forward, her body driven by something deeper than fear now, by the knowledge that stopping meant dying. Cole fired another volley, buying them seconds, and they crashed through the underbrush until the sound of rushing water rose ahead. The river glimmered faintly in the moonlight, its current strong, and Cole seized her arm, dragging her toward it. Without hesitation he plunged into the icy water, pulling her with him, and they let the current carry them downstream as bullets cracked overhead and voices raged on the banks. The freezing water stole Maria's breath, her body convulsing with cold, but she clung to Cole, letting the river swallow them, the current masking their escape. They drifted for what felt like hours, tossed against rocks, their clothes heavy and sodden, until finally the banks rose higher and Cole steered them toward the shore. They crawled onto the mud, shivering, gasping, their bodies numb but alive. Maria collapsed onto her back, staring up at the stars through a veil of tears, every nerve in her body screaming. Cole sat beside her, wringing water from his sleeves, his expression grim but determined. He told her they had bought time, nothing more, and that the men hunting them would not give up until either they were dead or the truth was dragged into the light. Maria turned her head to him, her teeth chattering, and whispered that she was so tired, that she wanted it to end. Cole's voice softened then, almost gentle, as he said endings never come easy, that the only way to find peace was to fight through the storm until nothing was left standing against them. His words terrified her but also anchored her, giving shape to the fire that had begun to grow inside her since that first shot on the empty road. She sat up slowly, pulling the revolver from her pocket, staring at it with new eyes. It was no longer just a weapon, it was a symbol of every choice she had been forced to make, of the strength she never knew she carried. She tightened her grip and whispered that she would not run forever, that if they wanted to silence her, they would have to face her. Cole's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw not just a weary detective but a man who believed in her, who saw her not as a victim but as an ally. The river roared beside them, the night thick with danger, but Maria felt the weight inside her shift. She was still afraid, still trembling, but beneath the fear was steel. The hunt was far from over, but she knew now she would not be the one who broke first. The night faded slowly into the gray of dawn as Maria and Cole followed the river's edge, their clothes clinging damp and heavy, their bodies aching from the brutal escape. The forest was quiet now except for the call of distant birds waking with the morning, but Maria knew the silence was only a disguise, that behind it lurked men searching, men who would not rest until her blood soaked the ground. Each step forward felt like it carried the weight of all that had happened, from the moment she had stopped at the flashing lights to the moment she pulled the trigger and changed her life forever. Cole walked beside her, steady though worn, his eyes scanning constantly, his hand never far from his pistol. They reached the remains of an old mill as the sun broke the horizon, its rusted frame leaning over the river like a wounded beast, windows shattered, walls scarred by years of abandonment. Cole motioned her inside and they slipped through a broken doorway, the air thick with dust and the scent of damp stone. In the center of the floor sat a man and a woman waiting, both dressed in worn clothes, both with eyes that had the haunted look of people who had seen too much. Cole introduced them as Anna and Briggs, allies who had once fought his same battle and lost everything for it. They greeted Maria not with pity but with respect, and for the first time she felt like she was not alone in this fight. Anna handed her a dry coat, Briggs offered a piece of bread, and though her body screamed for rest, Maria forced herself to listen as Cole spread his folder of evidence across a crate. They spoke quickly, voices hushed, tracing the lines of corruption through names and places, mapping the brotherhood that stretched its grip over towns and counties. Maria listened, her fears slowly giving way to anger as she realized how deep the rot went, how many lives had been ruined, how many silences bought with blood. She clenched her fists, telling them she wanted to help, that she would not hide anymore, and Cole nodded firmly, saying her voice, her survival, was proof that the system could not bury the truth forever. But before their plans could take root, the roar of engines shattered the quiet, echoing against the metal walls of the mill. Maria's stomach turned to ice and Briggs cursed under his breath, grabbing his rifle. Cole's jaw tightened as he told them they had been found, that someone had followed their trail. The sound grew louder, closer, until vehicles skidded to a halt outside and boots thundered against the ground. Voices barked orders, the same tone of authority twisted into violence, and Maria realized they were surrounded. The walls of the mill trembled with the first impact of gunfire, glass exploding, metal ringing as bullets ripped through the air. Maria dropped to the floor, her heart racing, while Cole returned fire through a broken window. Anna and Briggs fought fiercely, their weapons crackling in the chaos, but the attackers pressed closer, relentless, determined to crush them. Maria's hands shook as she raised her revolver, the noise deafening, the smoke burning her throat, and she fired at the shadow of a man charging through the doorway. He fell with a scream, and the reality of it struck her again. She was not the same woman who had once planted flowers quietly in her garden. She was someone else now, someone who fought because there was no other choice. The battle raged, bodies falling, voices screaming, the mill shuddering as if it might collapse under the fury, and through it all Maria kept firing, her mind a blur of fear and rage. Then a familiar voice cut through the madness, a voice she thought she had left bleeding on the road, the officer she had shot, his laugh raw and jagged, calling her name. Maria froze, her blood running cold, and through the haze of smoke she saw him limping into the mill, his uniform stained dark, his eyes wild with hatred. He raised his gun and aimed straight at her, shouting that she had ruined everything, that she would die here, nameless and forgotten. Time slowed, the world narrowing to the circle of his gun and the pounding of her heart. Cole shouted her name, Briggs fired, Anna screamed, but Maria stood frozen, her revolver raised, her eyes locked on the man who had dragged her into this nightmare. He pulled the trigger, the blast tearing past her ear, close enough to burn, and instinct roared through her. She fired back, once, twice, 3 times, each shot slamming into him until his body jerked and crumpled onto the floor. Silence crashed over the mill as the remaining attackers faltered, some fleeing into the trees, others falling beneath the return fire. The air stank of smoke and blood, the floor littered with shells and shattered glass, and Maria stood shaking, her revolver smoking in her hand, staring at the man who had once thought her an easy victim. Cole stepped to her side, his voice rough but steady, telling her it was over, at least for now. Anna and Briggs moved among the fallen, checking for survivors, gathering weapons, but Maria could not move, could not breathe, until finally she dropped the revolver and sank to her knees. Tears spilled down her face, not just from fear or relief but from the sheer weight of everything that had been torn from her. Cole knelt beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder, reminding her that she had done what few could, that she had stood against monsters and lived. Maria lifted her head, her eyes burning, and whispered that she was tired of running, that she wanted the truth to burn brighter than their lies. Cole met her gaze and nodded, promising that together they would take the evidence, the testimony, the proof, and carry it into the light no matter the cost. The rising sun poured through the broken windows, casting long beams across the ruin, and Maria felt its warmth on her face. She was scarred, haunted, changed forever, but she was alive, and more than alive, she was resolved. The simple woman who had once only dreamed of quiet nights and small joys was gone, and in her place stood someone forged in fire, someone who had faced death and refused to bow. The war was not finished, the hunt not ended, but as the sun climbed higher, Maria rose with it, ready to face whatever came next. The end.